now, it's time for our children's moment. This is our kids' lesson. Now, our lessons the past few weeks, we've been talking about this really big thing. We've been talking about fear, what it feels like, and what God has to say about it. One week, we learned the story from the Bible when the disciples were so scared on the boat because they were in the middle of a big storm. And then Jesus calmed the storm and he said, "Trust me." Are you listening to your fears instead of me? So we talked about we should listen to the voice of faith, what God has to say, instead of what our fears are telling us. We also talked last week about what fear feels like. What do you feel like when you're afraid? Sometimes fear can feel like you're tied up in a knot. You're all knotted up in your stomach. But God is saying, I don't want you to be tied up in a knot. I want you to have faith. Trust that I am God and I am working everything together for your good. So when we have faith inside of us, it means we can trust God to do his job and we don't have to. We don't have to be tied up in knots. Well, this week, I have another story from the Bible that I want to share with you about faith and a little fear. I'm going to read it from the Spark Story Bible, published by Spark House. Walking on water. The disciples were just waking up in their boat. They had been out on the water all night. Yawn, stretch. It was so early the sun wasn't even up yet. Andrew rubbed his eyes and looked into the fog. "Hey," he whispered, "do you see what I see?" "Oh, it's a ghost!" James cried out in fear. The disciples were shaking in their sandals. They were terrified. Through the fog, they could see the outline of a person walking on the water. It was Jesus. "Don't be afraid, it's just me," Jesus said. He waved hello. "If it's really you, Jesus, tell me to walk on the water," Peter said bravely. "Okay," Jesus shrugged. "Come on out, Peter. The water is fine." Gulp. Peter swallowed hard. He placed one foot onto the water. Plop! It didn't go under. He tried the other foot. Plop! He was standing. He kept his eyes glued on Jesus as he took a few careful steps. He walked faster and faster. Splish, splash, only his feet were getting wet. Jesus smiled at him. Peter felt the wind blowing on his face. He took his eyes off of Jesus and he looked up at the dark clouds. He felt afraid. Uh-oh, his ankles were wet. Uh-oh, his knees were wet. Uh-oh, Peter was sinking. "Help me, Jesus, save me," he yelled. Jesus reached out his hand and pulled Peter out of the sea. "Why did you stop looking at me?" Jesus asked, holding tightly to his friend. "Don't you trust me?" The wind stopped. They climbed into the boat full of cheering disciples. "Hooray, this proves it," they said. "You really are the Son of God." And from that day on, the disciples were excited to tell everyone they met about the power of Jesus. Wow, Peter was walking on water. Have you ever seen somebody walk or even stand on top of water? I haven't, because it's not something that we as humans are able to do. Why was Peter able to do it? Because he was focused on Jesus. And through God, all things are possible. But tell me, in the story, what happened when Peter took his eyes off Jesus? When Peter started to realize all of the things there were to be afraid of, like the wind and the water, he was starting to get scared that he was going to sink in the water. And he wasn't focused on Jesus. He was focused on his fear. What happened then? Well, that's when Peter started to sink. And Jesus said, "Don't you trust me?" See, boys and girls, there's lots of things in life that can cause us to feel afraid. But God is telling us that he wants us to have faith over all of these fears. God tells us in the Bible so many times, do not fear, do not worry, do not let your hearts be troubled. I am with you. He tells us again and again. So this jar here, this is going to be like our fear. And the water inside, that's going to be our fears. So what kinds of things make you afraid? Well, there's lots of things to be afraid of, like being alone, or maybe you're afraid of getting sick or losing a loved one, or you're afraid what's going to happen in the future. There are so many things that can cause fear. Now, how would you feel if I dumped this jar of water all over your head? I wouldn't like it either. Probably wouldn't feel very good. And as I'm looking at it, if somebody were about to dump it on my head, I'd probably feel the same way that Peter felt as he's walking on that water and realizing, oh goodness, I'm about to sink. I'm about to get all wet. I wouldn't want this to happen to me. But God is saying, I've got you. I want you to have faith. So that means I'm going to use my faith in God to block all those fears. I'm going to pray over my fears and I'm going to give it to God. I'm going to read God's word and remind myself of what he says whenever I am afraid, what he says to do, and how he says to trust. What happens when I turn this jar over? What do you think is going to happen? Well, we'll see. I'm going to flip it over and we'll see if our faith can block it. Count down with me. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so our fears are now being blocked by our faith. But what happens if I take my hand away? Is our faith strong enough to block all of those fears? It is. Boys and girls, with God, all things are possible. I've stood in front of this bulletin board the last few weeks for a reason. What does the bulletin board behind me say? My lifeguard walks on water. I want you to remember that, because in a world filled with fear, you have somebody who can save you, somebody who can do the impossible, who can walk on water. And that is a really good feeling. Have a great week. I'll see you again soon.